Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, a podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity and find out a little bit about their journey, the events that have shaped their career, and maybe those things that still keep them up at night. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin E. Greene, Chief Security Strategist for Public Sector at BeyondTrust, a veteran of the cybersecurity industry with over 25 years' experience, spanning roles at Ernst Young, the Department of Homeland Security, MITRE, and most recently BeyondTrust. Kevin has been instrumental in shaping software security practices, including leading significant cybersecurity R&D initiatives with multi-million-dollar budgets, contributing to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and funding pioneering research that was later commercialized by major security companies. Beyond his technical prowess, Kevin's also known for his passion for hip-hop music and has a few surprising connections to the music industry. For those of you watching on YouTube, you'll might have already noticed Kevin's t-shirt, which has a little bit of a hip-hop nod there and secure coding by nature. So Kevin, welcome to the podcast and thanks for wearing the t-shirt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. So let's jump right in. Where did your interest in computers, technology, and IT first begin?
So I think right out of high school, I was accepted to New Jersey Institute of Technology. We call it NJIT in New Jersey, which is a very technical school. So I remember going in over the summer, building our own computers, because they give every student a computer. Nowadays, I don't think you're building a laptop. They just give you a laptop, right? But we had to build our own computers. So I think that sparked the passion from a technical standpoint, and really just made me want to pursue a more technical approach from a career standpoint as I, went through and matriculated through my 5 years at NJIT. Because I did do an internship, which also kind of helped me get in tune with my passion for technology. So I think I did extent at UPS, working on a technical help desk. I did something at ADP, working with payroll, quality assurance stuff. So I think it really whet my appetite for pursuing a career in the technology field.
And in those early days, I believe one of your first roles was Bell Atlantic, now part of Verizon, and you kind of got into the network operations side there. How did that opportunity come about?
Yeah, so right out of NJIT, I got accepted for a role at Bell Atlantic at the time. It was Verizon, right? So they moved me down to Maryland. I worked out of the Silver Spring office. And I was working in the network operations center. So we were talking about, monitoring all the T1 lines that were associated with their infrastructure. I can remember this is around the time firewalls were starting to spark up, right? And they had this change control window at midnight. I would work my normal shift, go home, do my homework, because I was actually taking my master's via distance learning as well. So I would go home, do my homework for my master's program, get a little sleep, eat, and then go back to the change control window. And what I did was I shoulder surfed and watched, how firewall upgrades were made, configurations of firewalls during the change control window. At the time, it wasn't really a firewall. It was basically a Sun box, Solaris box. I'm sure you're familiar with a bastion host, right? It was more of a bastion host than a firewall, right? But, it was an opportunity for me to kind of learn about firewalls, about segmentation, about policy enforcement, and, flowing traffic in and out. And eventually I took that, leveraged that as an opportunity to get into doing firewalls. And I worked at a managed firewall company. This is when the .com was starting and booming. And I was a company called PSINet, which was a ISP here in Herndon, Virginia. And they had a managed services, and we would manage all the firewalls for them. I must have configured over 300, 400 firewalls in my lifetime. So that kind of sparked my passion around firewalls. That's kind of how I got into security, right? Just being, curious, wanting to learn, putting in the extra work to round my career out. And it's something I would never forget, and it's put me on the path where I'm in. I'm 25, close to 27 years in cybersecurity. So it's provided a great life for me and my family, and I'm very glad that I made that sacrifice early on.
And when you say, those days configuring dozens, hundreds of firewalls, I think it's important to recognize that that was back then. Now everyone thinks of cloud and you just log into Azure or AWS, you configure it all, you do it remotely. What was the process involved in, configuring and physically setting up those firewall systems?
So I worked for a company, and I used to go, and these was the Nokia firewalls, the integrated Nokia firewalls that had checkpoint on them. I would go to my boss house. We would configure the firewalls in the basement. This is before he had uh, actual office space, right? But we would configure the firewalls in his basement. So it's from everything: understanding networking, understanding network topology, understanding the services that need to be, implemented from a firewall perspective, understanding how to install, upgrade. So it was everything from take it out the box, set up the network infrastructure or IPF information on the firewall, and everything from working with the customer to understand their requirements in terms of what they want in and out of their environment. But also, this is when DMZ was important. It was very part of the architecture, the ongoing architecture. We would build the DMZs and put services out there, whether it's a web service, whether it's a file server, whatever the case may be, but really try to understand that flow of traffic. Troubleshooting was also very important, right? Using sniffers to understand firewalls and understanding the traffic coming in and out. So it allowed me to really get not only the network background, but also the more the troubleshooting background, which was part of me really using my imagination to kind of solve problems. That's one of the things I'm big on. I'm a creative thinker, and problem solving is kind of some of the things that, if you're in this field, problem solving is one of the things where you go down this rabbit hole, it excites you if this is what you're into, right? So that was one of the things that, I never looked at it as, something that I hate doing. It was something that I really love and enjoy doing because it helped me kind of solve problems. And I think that's something that is very important for cyber, right? You have to be able to solve problems, think outside the box. Uh, Not all issues are the same in terms of troubleshooting, right? These fires that we see with firewalls, configurations, web services, sometimes some web services do some things funky. And when you have stateful firewalls, sometimes some things get blocked. So you have to figure out and troubleshoot what ports, what additional high ports are not being allowed through. So all these things were part of shaping and troubleshooting. So I enjoyed those are the days that I still remember fondly in my mind. So.
And that kind of idea of just, you unbox it, you're configuring it in a basement and then having to physically deliver it to client site and then kind of hoping everything was configured right. It's very different to deploying something in production today in a cloud service and in real time being able to test things and tweak things remotely. What were some of the challenges when you got onto client site of getting those things actually in there and set up?
Well, one thing is over time, the firewalls got a lot lighter, right? so so carrying these firewalls in these boxes, sometimes like depending on the size of the firewall, like I said, the Nokia firewalls back in the day, they could be kind of, heavy if it's, depending on the size of the firewall. But over time, the firewalls got a lot smaller. But I do think, that's why troubleshooting becomes very important. Working with the network operations, because how it is, it's territorial. It's the same things we do today. I'm putting a firewall into a network environment. The network guys, is not my issue, it's your issue. So you got to troubleshoot to prove that it's not your issue. You got to help the network guys without making them look bad. So it was constant. It was constant negotiating, constant politics. But all in all, like you had to know what you were doing to kind of, get the support that you need to solve problems. And that's one of the things I pride myself on, really trying to work across the aisle and really try to, be very diplomatic about how we do things, because I do think people have feelings, people are emotional, people are sensitive, and you have to be able to kind of show people and be collaborative and working with them in solving problems. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges that we had to work through, because, everything was territorial when it came to these network operations centers, these data centers.
And the skills you've just described there are exactly the skills that most people look for in consultancy practices. And this is actually the direction you took as you started to hone in on that security thing. I believe you went to Ernst Young.
Yeah, I went to work at Ernst Young, which was probably the most memorable part of my career, because it was early on, and I've always tried to pride myself on being good at a lot of different things, especially if you're going to be a consultant, you have to have a broad range of things. You have to be good at a lot of different things. Because when you show up at a client site, you never know what you're going to face. So part of that was doing, at the time, ethical hacking, right? This is the time where penetration testing was popular because, as I mentioned, all these .coms are starting to pop up, these websites and things of that nature. So organizations wanted to make sure if we're going to move from brick and mortar and go to an online presence, we got to make sure that we can protect our investments, our infrastructure. So Ernst Young had obviously is the consultant practice around IT and financial auditing, and then from there was a cybersecurity group that was formed to do vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, ethical hacking, however you want to call it. So there, I kind of learned some new skills and really trying to understand, not only building systems but also how do you break them and penetrate them. And this is around a time where um, you know all the assessments that we were doing. So I was spending time at Capital One in Richmond. For the most part, that was kind of most of where I spent most of my time, and really building out their data center, doing penetration testing. At that time, we would work with our national practice. So I was local in the McLean, Virginia office. Our national practice had some of the likes of like Stuart McClure, who went on to start Cylance. George Kurtz was part of that. All the guys from Foundstone was there. So you talk about Chris Procyse, you talk about William Chan, Gary Bador. Like they were all part of the national practice. Lamont Orange as well. They were all part of national practice. So we work with them to kind of codify and build this practice out, and work with customers to not only do the vulnerability assessment piece, but also do penetration testing as a way to validate their security posture.
So there was definitely some magic in the air with those kind of colleagues you had there in those early days at Ernst Young. And like you say, it was a relatively immature industry. People were starting to follow the .com boom, get online. What were some of the challenges? Because, some of my memories from back around that time were there was a lot of challenges with instability of systems. And just by doing security tests, just by doing things, you could knock things offline, you could get blue screens of death, all kinds of issues. What was that like in those early days? How did you tread that line between keeping clients operational and making sure they were secure?
So our testing methodology had to be precise, pristine, right? And one of the things we did to try to avoid that was, these change control windows, out of hours windows where organizations had that downtime where they can reserve that space to do penetration test in the event something happens like a blue string. And the blue screen of death was the thing. If you were able to make a system go blue screen, like that was like the capture the flag type moment where it was something that organizations kind of tried to avoid, but it was also an opportunity for us to kind of demonstrate our capabilities. But I think so much has changed in terms of the different threats and different types of things that could go wrong, that will go wrong in terms of penetration testing. Because as you said, a lot of these systems are very fragile. I mean, you do some type of denial of service, the system is offline, right? If you do map with the wrong flags, the system can go offline. So you have to be very meticulous in terms of the testing methodology to avoid some of these things, but also make sure that it was in control environment, doing a change control window where if these things did happen, it didn't cost the company money or time or whatever the case may be.
And what were some of the key challenges that customers were facing in those days? Were there common themes that you were coming across time and time again?
It was mostly misconfiguration of web services that we always would see. The database, this is cross-site scripting, SQL injection. These things were like at the infancy stages of cropping into the threat landscape that we know today that has, was over 25 years now, and cross-site scripting and SQL injection is still part of the OWASP top 25. So much has changed, but hasn't changed, right? But back then, it was really trying to make sure that, there were controlling the flow of traffic in and out and making sure that the web server was configured properly. This is before all of the things that we see now with, the IIS server was mainly the major web server that was used around that time. And, if you were able to follow the best practices without, the misconfiguration, I think you did a pretty good job in making sure that you put the right protection mechanisms and controls in place to protect the web server. But overall, I think that was kind of the challenges, making sure that the web servers were configured properly, but also the infrastructure behind it was configured properly, especially when you start putting DMZ there and allowing communication in and out of the DMZ, making sure that the backend stuff was properly protected and that you had the right firewalls in place and right rules in place. So I think overall that opportunity to see how far you can get from the web server back to the back end was also something that we kind of make sure we develop as part of our testing methodology. We want to also test the front end. We want to see how far we can get into your organization to see what type of damage we could do.
And you mentioned some great things there around those cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that are still seen in the, OWASP top 10, top 25, things that haven't gone away. And it's interesting to see actually how your career kind of moved into a more strategic role. And the thing we probably know you best for is that public sector, the area of government. How did you transition into that area of focus in your career?
So I think the EY brand, Ernst Young brand, carried a lot of weight in the Beltway, right? The DMV area. So, I decided, at that point that, this is around the time where all the national guys basically left, George, Stuart, and that's how Foundstone kind of came to be. So it was like, do I want to hang around and with this transition? So I decided to, do some consulting around Beltway and, federal contracting in the government. And I landed on a couple of spots while helping organizations, basically taking my experience from doing penetration testing, ethical hacking, and using it in the form of IVV, right, independent verification and validation, for systems that need to be certified and accredited as part of the FISMA process. So it was me taking that, developing a methodology, and trying to bring more application security testing to the CNA process, which at that point, it was basically doing a lot of network testing. Because if you look back at NIST 853, it was heavily focused on network, right? The early on iterations and versions of 853 catalog, it was really focused on network security. And what I tried to do was incorporate application security testing as part of that to get better coverage around threats that were part of a certification accreditation boundary, especially as organizations started using more web services, using more application middle tier and things of that nature, that will be that gateway into a backend system like a database or something where sensitive data will reside. So I made sure that I tried to incorporate, as part of the IVV process, application security testing. So I would do static and dynamic analysis as part of that, right? I would extend that and add value into that. And organizations loved that. A lot of federal organizations wasn't doing it at the time. So I kind of, was one of the first to try to do that. And I think it provided a lot. And this is when I was doing consulting as a contractor for the Department of Homeland Security. So I would do a lot of testing around headquarters systems, and eventually we started to see more and more NIST 853 catalog start being more friendlier towards application security, because that was a growing attack vector that wasn't part of the early process of the catalog, the 853 catalog. So I do think that experience at Ernst Young helped provide some fundamental shifts in federal government in terms of application security, and really trying to make sure that we increase the coverage around threat actor capabilities.
And was there a huge amount of appetite in the federal government for it? Was it something, there was a vacuum that was just waiting to be filled, or was there a bit of resistance to implementing some of these things?
It was resistance because, hey, this is not what we used to, right? These artifacts are different from the artifacts we received. We received a Nessus scanner report or some vulnerability, Foundstone report or something to that nature, and all I need to do is fix and patch, right? But when you start bringing and introducing additional attack surface areas like application security, I do think it brings other stakeholders to the table. So now, just think about the time, even this is before DevOps even became, so you can imagine how siloed a lot of these federal organizations were, and everyone was pointing fingers. This is not my issue, throwing stuff over the fence. That's back in when security, hey, we ran the scans, I'm gonna throw it over the fence, you fix it. And that was a very, very interesting culture. So trying to navigate that was very, very important. And I had to figure out what's the best way to navigate that. How can we make sense of the reporting of our material weaknesses and vulnerabilities so that organizations would take the time to fix it, right? As opposed to ignoring, it's not my job, is this, or finger pointing. So I do think, being very diplomatic and understanding how to articulate risks, which became the main thing, is making sure. So this is the time is you're trying to figure out how do we bring these in from a risk management standpoint and document this as part of the POAM process, plan of action, and milestones, because that becomes very important for organizations to track risk, but also develop compensated controls to mitigate those risks, right? So I do think, navigating that and really trying to work across those silos became very important.
And another aspect you kind of briefly touched on was that combination of static and dynamic analysis. And one of the things that people often don't actually associate with kind of DHS, federal organizations, is driving innovation necessarily in the cybersecurity space. A lot of people assume it's the startups that are doing that, but you're actually involved in funding research that then led to commercial successes and then actually moved the industry forward. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the research you funded and how you prioritized that funding and then how that became commercialized ultimately?
So those experiences doing IVMV as a contractor kind of set the tone for when I grow up, what I want to be when I grow up type of thing. But I think understanding some of those challenges with those testings, right? So you have static and dynamic. Those are two different type of reports. How do you consolidate it? How do you correlate it? Everything was manual at that point, right? So you had to cross-reference. If I see this vulnerability from a DAS standpoint, dynamic application security testing standpoint, how does this relate to this finding from a static analysis perspective, and trying to make sense of that data. So those challenges, although the separate reports provided value, I just think they were kind of not correlated in a way where it provided a complete picture. So when I went to become a federal employee at Department of Homeland Security in the Science and Technology Directorate, I was a computer sciences program manager, and my program was around software security assurance. And one of the first things that I did was I funded research in hybrid analysis mapping. It's called HAM, hybrid analysis mapping. Essentially figuring out a way, how can we leverage the strengths of static and dynamic analysis in a meaningful way to increase the fidelity of results, but also help reduce false positives, but also enumerate the entire attack surface on a web application server, so that now you can drive deeper coverage of testing, right? That's one of the things I wanted to do. And we proved that. So I funded research through something called Small Business Innovation Research, SIBR. I basically was $75K to build a prototype. And then from $75K, you move up, whatever, $150K, then eventually it goes to $750K as a phase 3. So what I did was I decided to double down on, not doing a down select for one performer, but I decided to fund both of them in parallel, because they took different approaches to building out the hybrid analysis mapping. So the company was called Secure Decisions, which had a product called CodeDX, and the other one was Denim Group. They had a product called ThreatFix. So we helped commercialize that technology, built it out. They built their whole business around the hybrid analysis mapping and technology. So it was one of those things where I invested in something that I saw as a challenge and helped provide a solution using government-funded research, and eventually proved to be something that made sense, right? So if you look at after these technologies were built through the program, they both have been commercialized. CodeDX was acquired by Synopsys, and Dental Group was acquired by Coalfire. So So Coalfire, as part of FedRAMP, they're testing federal applications using technology that was funded through S&T, which is a huge success, right? We want to make sure we maximize the value of taxpayers' dollars. We want to be able to get over the valley of death, across the valley of death. So these commercialization stories became something that I prided myself on because I want to make sure we maximize research. And if you look at what we see from Gartner from their application security testing, a lot of the research from my hybrid analysis mapping program help influence what we see now with the application security posture management. Because initially, the work that was funded through my program with hybrid analysis mapping helped shape the application vulnerability correlation hype cycle as part, because they have a hype cycle before they move to a Magic Quadrant. And then that eventually turned into application security orchestration. And then that led to what we see with the application security posture management. So, I think, I'm going to call myself a trendsetter because I do think that, so the work that I funded through my program helped shape what Gartner considers today application security posture management category as part of application security testing tools, which I'm very proud of, and I could take some credit for that.
Well, that's a great pat on the back for yourself there. And it's really good to see those success stories of the kind of the public-private partnership there. On that journey, there must have been other things that were involved in that program that you thought were a great idea, but never quite made it. Is there an idea there that you think, oh, I wish that had been as big a success?
So as we look at like secure by design and software as bills of materials, like I've always, when I see these things and they come up and they don't take off like they should, or I'm very critical of certain things. And I've always said, like, if I was a Fed, this is what I would do, right? And I funded things like tool studies, and tool studies were important because if you remember around the time of Heartbleed, none of the static analysis tools were able to detect the weakness that exposed the Heartbleed vulnerability, right? So that led me to look at what is the testing methodology of trying to benchmark these static analysis tools? Like what is the false positive rates and true positive rates in these tools? And from a research standpoint, I took it on upon myself to do that. Now, NSA had, through their Center for Assured Software, already were doing some testing through NIST, software assurance, maturity. Sorry, I forget these names. NSA was already doing some benchmarking with tools and working with NIST through their software assurance metrics and tool evaluation called SME. But the problem with that was a lot of the vendors felt the test harness for SME was synthetic and it didn't represent real world programs. So one of the things I tried to do was I tried to fund a tool study around this to try to advance the state of the art and state of practice and really develop a new generation of test cases that represented real world code, right? Real applications, right? So I started a new program called Static Tool Analysis Modernization Program. And that was a couple of things, right? So I was watching HGTV with my wife one day. And this is this show called Property Brothers, where you have one brother who find neglected homes, and then you have the other brother who pumps money in to renovate them. I said, wow, like that would be a great idea to have as a New Start program to re-innovate static analysis for open source tools, right? I only focus on open source tools. So what I did was I modeled the Property Brothers concept and identified neglected open source static analysis tools, and I funded modernization across that. So I'm not sure you're familiar with a company called Grammatech. Grammatech was the primary investigator in leading that research. So they were able to build a next generation of test cases to model real world code, which I think was very important to try to understand what are tools good at. Each tool has a strength, right? No one tool can cover an entire program structure, right? In terms of, if you look at it, Java, each Java program has different program structures, right? Tool A, B, C may be good at this program structure. The others may be good at another type of Java program structure. So I wanted to kind of like raise the bar, but also help organizations better select which tools best match their software assurance needs, right? And as part of that, we were able to modernize test cases. The other piece was to retest these tools and benchmark them. And then the other was to provide like a consumer's buyer's guide to organizations so that they can understand what tools are really good at. Like I believe when you're doing static analysis, the sum of many is better than the sum of one because they all find different things, right? They're not all of them are sound and precise across all program structures. So I think it's important to use a mixed bag of static analysis tools. Some could be commercial, some could be open source. But I think, if you have a way based on the hybrid analysis work that I did, now you can bring in multiple static analysis tools, correlate those static analysis tools to figure out which issues, vulnerabilities that have been identified that you need to focus on. So I do think, there was some progress made there, but static analysis still is falling short. We're seeing now AI trying to be supplemented into the ecosystem now as a way to try to bring static analysis up to par, but I still think there's some shortcomings there. I've always believed that you can add heuristics, you can add rules to static analysis, but at the end of the day, if the core engine is lackluster, the tools are not going, they are ultimately going to fail. And I don't think anyone took the time to rebuild static analysis engine. Right now, you see a lot of static analysis tool vendors popping up. They're doing linting and all these other things, but they're not really doing, if you look at how Fortify started, you look at how Grammatech started, these were started out of academic universities, right? These are hardcore computer sciences. This is not me just adding a linter or something and thinking I can find some of these greases and hard to find weaknesses that eventually can be exposed vulnerabilities. So I do think, I don't know, static analysis is useful, but I'm not sure in today's world how useful it is in finding some of the harder type issues around secure programming.
Yeah, some real challenges out there. And I'm just sat here thinking, I wonder if property bros ever realized that they had such an impact on the world of cybersecurity there.
See, I don't know. I think that there's always an intersection between cyber and something in industry. We just have to find what that intersection is, right? So cyber to me is very powerful. But to your point, I think these motivations, and when I talk about using your imagination, like, I get up early, I commune with the universe and my divine self. But it helps me to think outside the box. And when you think outside the box, you could identify concepts and things that you can explore to try to solve challenges and problems. And I think for our industry, the US, our culture is very risk averse. We don't think outside the box. The threat actors are constantly thinking outside the box. We have to push ourselves to think outside the box. And I take pride in doing that because I do think, you find new things, in terms of breaking. When you break and you fix things, you get a different appreciation for things. You get a different revelation, which is important to kind of, as we embark on this cyber journey and trying to figure out how do we keep pace with threat actors. They have a lot of ingenuity. They have a lot of opportunity to fail fast and try new things. And I think we get slapped on the wrist for trying to do some of those things. I just wish our culture will be a little bit more risk averse where we can try new things and fail fast.
Well, no, actually, one of the challenges we often see in the industry is everything becomes a technology problem to fix. And everyone thinks that because it's a new technology, it's a brand new problem. But like you say, there's often concepts throughout history, throughout human nature, throughout reality television that we can map onto these domains and actually learn the lessons of there. What are some of the key areas that you think as an industry we should be thinking more about to take more risks, to move faster and not get slowed down?
So I just think overall our culture is risk averse. Like we're very reactive. Like just from a cybersecurity standpoint. And I've learned a lot of lessons by looking at the doctrine from DoD in their defend for and protect for philosophies, right? I think a lot could be applied to cyberspace because there's constant cyber engagement in cyberspace by threat actors. There's a lot of geopolitical things and tensions that's going on in this world. And we have to be ready to defend our missions, our environments. So I do think, shifting from being reactive to proactive and what I call responsive cyber defense becomes very important. How can we anticipate, adapt, and evolve in a meaningful way that allow us to disrupt threat actors' capabilities? Like, I'm not saying you're going to ever stop cyber attacks, but I think it's up to you to disrupt them, right? And I've been on this concept of prevention is a new detection, simply because of that. Because I think we're detecting threats and cyber attacks too late in the attack life cycle. And I do think if we can get early warning signs around things around our identity security posture, identity hygiene, we can get those telltale early warning signs early enough. I do think it allows us to be more preventative. And when we're preventative, we reduce the attack surface. And when we reduce the attack surface, we can be more resilient against cyber attacks. We can disrupt them. So I do think trying to figure out how do we, I'm going to say push, but how do we move industry to a less reactive approach into a more proactive approach is something that I've been advocating for in my thought leadership and I go to market because I do think cyber defense is important. If we look at where a lot of the budget is from a federal perspective, it's all around cyber defense initiatives. So trying to figure out a way to tell our identity security story from a cyber defense perspective becomes very important. And I do think if we look at in most all cyber attacks, they need a compromised account and they need to pivot to elevate privileges, right? So if we can remove those attack vectors, I do think we can be more resilient against cyber attacks. So to me, that's part of elevating cyber defense. And so that's kind of one of the things that I think if we can figure out and articulate that, help organizations see the value of really, really good identity security, I do think we can help organizations not only prevent cyber breaches, but be more resilient and help disrupt threat actor capabilities.
And in terms of that prevention and understanding, the attack surface that they have out there, I know one of the projects you were involved in, which probably most of our audience is familiar with, is MITRE ATT&CK. What was your involvement in MITRE ATT&CK? How did you see it evolve, and where would you like to see it go in 2025, really?
So when I was on MITRE, this is when they started and formed the Center for Threat Informed Defense. So MITRE obviously was funded through government funding, and some I think MITRE funding as well. But because MITRE is an FFRDC, Federal Funded Research Development Corporation, they can't take money from industry. So they had to figure out a way, how do we take money from industry? So they started a not-for-profit called the Center for Threat Informed Defense. So I was working as part of that project. So we had different sponsors. So they get sponsors from industry to sponsor certain projects. So before that, so for me, it started with like 853. I think that catalog is very static. It's not threat informed. Threat actors have already enumerated the entire catalog. So I wanted to look at, like, if you look at all the attacks, I felt like there's certain controls that if you had a heat map, there were certain controls that would light up for every attack that we saw, right? We see. So I felt like there was a subset of controls as part of the 853 catalog that were pertinent across all the attacks. I wanted to focus on that. So I initially did a paper, and eventually the MITRE attack team caught wind of the paper, and it was a proposal for a program that I was working on. So that's how I got involved with MITRE ATT&CK. So essentially what we did with MITRE ATT&CK was we did research, and the sponsors were JP Morgan Chase, Attack IQ, the Center for Internet Security. And what we did was we looked at all the entire 853 catalog, and we were able to figure out how do we map this into an attack? Because we wanted to see across all attacks, here are the controls that can help mitigate threat actor behaviors, right? So if you're planning system development, if you're implementing system development, you can be informed about threats that are likely to happen, and you can build better security control protection into your design. So that was a notion of really trying to work on MITRE ATT&CK, was really help bring more threat-informed approach to the 853 Cylance. So when organizations are implementing, they are focusing on the controls with the best coverage across MITRE ATT&CK, right? And threat actor CTPs. So it was a wonderful project. It's currently on GitHub right now, where they update the 853 mappings, because it is a way to kind of, visualize and see, if I'm building a system, here's the controls that are essential that I need. So it was one of those things where 853 probably needs to be revamped, but the lesser I'll settle for, the mappings to kind of help inform cyber defenders, system developers in terms of how they need to develop systems and protection mechanisms around critical systems in federal government.
And in terms of MITRE ATT&CK now, it's obviously a very valuable tool. It's great to see people, mapping their defenses across it, especially with, like you say, that focus to literally on the MITRE framework, shift left, break the attack chain as early as possible. But I think there's probably some challenges in the age of identity security around MITRE ATT&CK and, where it goes there, because a lot of those are kind of endpoint network exploitation techniques you're looking at there, less so on the identity side. What are your thoughts about the future direction for that project?
I think MITRE has done a pretty good job at, curating threat intelligence around things in the wild, right? But the problem with threat intelligence is tell you what has already happened, right? So if we could get to a position where we can leverage the telemetry around MITRE ATT&CK to kind of anticipate what will happen, I think that will be, to me, that's the next frontier of trying to figure out how do we leverage the MITRE ATT&CK taxonomy and knowledge base in a way that allows us to be preventative, proactive, more responsive to cyber attacks, and use that as a way to codify that in our daily operations becomes very important. That threat intelligence to me is important, but I do think it needs to be, positioned in a way where we can try to understand what will happen, as opposed to just looking at the threats and having an understanding of what already happened. I think that's a good context and a good starting point. But as most organizations don't even have a threat profile, so they don't even know what type of threat actors are targeting them. And I think that's another piece that could potentially be integrated into the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base and is helping organizations automate that process or try to build that process around a threat profile. What does a threat profile look like for an organization? Even within, let's say, a federal agency, each agency has a different mission. So they're not going to have the same threat profile. So important to kind of figure out how do we build that threat profile as part of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So now you're curating threat intelligence that's specific to your mission. And I think the broad subset of MITRE ATT&CK is good. It's a good starting base, but now we have to start getting to curating threat intelligence specifically based on threat profile. And Scott Smalls does a good job at doing that and helping organizations understand how to build threat profiles. I think Scott Smalls is a really good threat intelligence analyst and practitioner. And for folks who are not familiar with him, I think he's on LinkedIn. He does a very good job in defining why a threat profile is important. And I do think if we're going to be more forward-leaning with MITRE ATT&CK, I think those are some ideas that they could potentially incorporate into that.
So as we kind of look to the future there, like you said, the challenge of a lot of these things is we're always looking back at what's been, but there's probably a lot of lessons that you've learned in your career that you can take moving forward. If we could give you the Alice and Bob magic wand and let you change one thing about the cybersecurity industry today, what would that be?
I don't think there's a such thing as secure software. All software has vulnerabilities or CWEs lurking, common weakness enumerations lurking somewhere in code. And I think having that as an end goal or outcome is misleading. I think it sets the wrong precedent, right? I would like for us to think about software security from a resiliency standpoint and build resiliency into the software security process, where we're understanding the need to practice software minimalism, where we're building software with only the essential components and things that we need, right? So we're deprecating APIs, we're removing network services, removing tools that, or redundant code that doesn't need to be there, right? These are things that can show up in your attack surface that gives a threat actor a lot to feast on. So I do think software resiliency should be an important piece that we kind of move towards, because I just don't think software security is attainable in this modern software world. And and if we can understand and build threat models around that, right, using threat modeling as a linchpin into that, and understanding like under certain conditions, you have a certain level of assurance that the software is going to perform at a certain level because you built resiliency into that. And I think if we can move towards that, I think we can create a not only a healthier software world, because everything is driven by software. Just look at AI. AI is software, right? And if you look at the executive order, the President Trump kind of kind of wanted to walk back some things because I don't think industry as a whole quite understand the attack surface associated with AI and vulnerabilities associated with AI. So this is an opportunity through the executive order for government, key government agencies, and academia to kind of look at that, right? Because software is it's so ubiquitous, it's a critical infrastructure. So if we're not building resilient software, I think we're in trouble. And one of the things I've always said is like, SDLC is good to have, right? We start thinking about this waterfall approach, but I think so much has changed from modern software. If there are 140 tasks that are associated with SDLC, I don't think we as an industry know which subset of the 140 actually works in producing better quality software. And I've always made the contention that we need to have some level of assurance in terms of what practices actually can contribute to producing better quality software, because it does a couple of things. It helps reduce the cost of software, because right now suppliers who are producing software, they have to go through all this process. So they're going to charge based on the amount of work they have to do. And I think suppliers will be more apt to focus on a smaller subset that has been proven to produce a certain level of quality of software. And I think it can help reduce some of the threats and challenges we see with software supply chain, especially open source. So I do think, changing our perspectives around software security, because I do think software security is our first line of defense. And I just think we need to shift from secure software to something around software resiliency, because I think, we need to be resilient against evolving threats and threat actor capabilities.
And that actually brings us nicely onto our final topic, which is secure coding. You've talked about that, and you're wearing your Naughty by Nature style t-shirt that says secure coding by nature. We've also dug up in our research that you use the social media handle Kevtorious. So tell us a little bit about the connection between secure coding and hip hop for you.
So, the Kevtorious is something that came about through tragedy, right? I'm a huge Notorious B.I.G. fan. It's the Notorio, right? It's part of his flow, right? And I was laying in the bed one day, and my birthday is on March 9th, and Notorious B.I.G. died on March 9th. So it was one of the ways to not only give homage to one of the greatest MCs ever, but at the time when everyone has to get an email handle, like Kevin Greene is so common. That name is so common. So I had to figure out a way to get something that was unique to me. So I used the handle Kevtorious. Is where cyber meets hip hop type of thing. I've always tried to make these connections to cyber, but it's also my way of giving homage to one who I think is one of the greatest MCs ever, Notorious B.I.G. So that's kind of how the Kevtorious came about. The secure coding came about was I grew up with Naughty by Nature, so I'm everything Naughty. I'm one of their biggest fans. Grammy Award winning group that grew up in the hood that I grew up in. So I'm very big on what the things that in the contributions they made to hip hop. So this is when the Giants won their last Super Bowl. I forgot when year that was. Vinny from Naughty by Nature had a shirt on that says Giants by Nature. And this is around a time where I was trying to advocate the importance of secure coding. And I wanted to use something to catch people's attention and help focus on why secure coding is very important, because it helps developers understand the consequences of the coding practices and creating vulnerabilities. So I said, let me develop these secure coding shirts as a way to to advocate for that, but also bring better awareness around the importance of secure coding and helping developers be aware of their refactoring practices and recoding factor. They're factoring in coding practices on creating vulnerabilities in software. So it was my way of trying to take something, make it hip, but also bring awareness to something I think is critically important.
I mean, I think it's a wonderful bridge there, because so a lot of the things you've been pushing for in the industry that you talked about, like being less risk averse, quickly innovating, taking risks, creative thinking. These are all kind of traits that are also associated with the hip hop music industry. So I think there's a wonderful crossover there that the lessons from hip hop can be translated across into the
But if
industry.
you look at hip hop, right, I can tell a DJ Premier beat from anybody. Like when a DJ Premier song comes on, I know it's DJ Premier. When a Pete Rock song comes on, I know it's Pete Rock. When a KG song from Nokia by Nature comes on, I know. Like there's elements in their music, and even certain rappers, the cadence they use, right? If like that's their TTPs, right? If you look at threat actors have their signatures, their fingerprints, right? That is unique to what they do. So there is some synergies between rappers and producers, right? In terms of their fingerprints, their style, their unique ability to do what they do. And I think we look at threat actors, especially I'm looking at the Iranian threat actors now, and figuring out how do we leverage insights, our identity security insights, to illuminate visibility around Iranian threat actors. They all have this set of things that they are known for, right? Now, they may modify certain things based on their tradecraft to kind of, build that stealth operation. But I think ultimately they all are known by certain TTPs, certain tradecraft, certain TTPs that are unique to what they do. So, there is a correlation where cyber meets hip hops to a certain degree.
And I think, given that Microsoft and Crowdstrike are trying to better collaborate on the naming of threat actors, maybe there's a project for you there in cross-referencing and giving them hip-hop names for the cyber threat actors, so people remember them better and be able to pick up on those techniques better.
I have no idea how they come across the names and why the names are so different from different threat intelligence groups, whether it's Recorded Future or Unit 42 or Microsoft or Crowdstrike. Like they all come up with their own name, like this, and they're nowhere near each other to a certain degree. But it's interesting, the naming convention for some of these threat actors and some of the campaigns that these threat actors take on. But ultimately, I do think if they were able to move to hip hop and use hip hop names and memes and things of that nature, I do think it'll be more memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. Before well, there's a project there. I'll go 50-50 on it with you, Kevin. You fund it and I'll come up with some names. Before we wrap up this episode, if people want to find out more about you and what you are up to, where's the best place to find out more about Kevin E. Greene?
You can find me at Kevin E. Greene on LinkedIn, or you can find me at www.kevinegreene.com. I'm always trying to, shift how we look at cyber, but also create forward-leaning approaches that allow us to keep pace with threat actors. We know that we know that threat actors' dwell times is decreasing, right? And we know that the time to attack is accelerating. So I think it's important for us to elevate our cyber defense, be more aware, and build that situational awareness, which is so important, and helping organizations and enterprises be on the early end of the attack lifecycle as opposed to the back end. And that's why I think being that BeyondTrust, it gives us an opportunity to help organizations kind of build those early warning signs and be more on the front end of the attack lifecycle so we can disrupt threat actors. I think identity is probably the best place to do that from a cybersecurity perspective. And if we can help organizations adapt and evolve their identity security posture, I think we're doing good. And that's my mission for the next several years, is to team with you as well as Mark to kind of figure out how we do that. So I'm very excited about that.
Well, that's great. And it's a great mission to be on. I'm glad to be on it with you, Kevin. Thank you very much for everything you're doing today and all the things you have done in the past to fund some of those research, to bring some of those things to light, and to ultimately keep people secure. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today on Adventures of Alice and Bob. A big thanks to our guest today, the notorious KEG, Kevin E. Greene, for sharing a little bit of his journey with us today and some of those stories from lifting those heavy firewalls into cars to securing identities in 2025. Fantastic journey to have shared with us. As always, thanks to our super producer Jesse and the team here at BeyondTrust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maude, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Bob.
Thank you for listening to the Adventures of Alice and Bob. Do you have any stories from the cybersecurity trenches that would make our listeners' jaws drop? If so, we would love to have you on the podcast. Maybe you faced down a ransomware attack with nothing but coffee and determination, discovered a breach in the most unexpected way, or had a pen test go horribly wrong. Whatever your tale, funny, harrowing, or just plain wild, we want to feature you on the show. To share your cybersecurity war stories, email us at booking@merchantsmedia.com.